Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name's Jacob Reynolds. I'm the head of policy for the think tank MCC Brussels, as well as an associate fellow of the Academy of Ideas. I'm delighted to welcome you to this one of Sunday's opening sessions, and the opening session in the strand, Geopolitics in Crisis. As far as this session goes, as we've titled it, October 7, 1 year on New World Disorder, we fully expect to dig into the kind of more regional geopolitical implications, looking a year after the awful pogrom of October 7 and the way that that's playing out in the region and the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran, etc. But also do want to kind of use that event as a little bit of an excuse to take a step back as well and try and grapple with some of maybe the broader trends that have been either unleashed or intensified as a result of the events that followed October 7 last year, of which there are obviously many. The one thing that we really wanted to do in putting this session on is try and get a bit of a handle on what you might call the globalization of the culture war. So the sense that no longer is it just we're talking about relationships between states and arguments about territory, et cetera, but that lots of these conflicts have acquired a kind of cultural dimension. So to take the obvious example, in the wake of October 7, you have this or I would suggest at least, and you'll feel free to argue with us in the comments, but you have this kind of union both of, say, radical Islamism, but also lots of, say, culture warrior, identity politics types here in the West. And so to unpack how these things have become internationalized and to throw some broad questions about the role of Israel, the role of America, the role of China in these kind of escalating global tensions. That's the slightly overambitious task that we've set ourselves today. But we do have a really, really wonderful panel to help us dig into this, and I'll just introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So speaking first, over on my right is Professor Bill Derodier. He's the Chair of International Relations at the University of Bath, as well as a visiting professor at a variety of places, but for me, he's visiting professor to us at MCC Brussels, which we're always very grateful for. Speaking second is Nick Busby, an OBE, who's a consultant. He's the founding partner of Humanist Holdings Limited, an advisory board member of Briefings for Britain, and for us, kind of maybe most pertinently, a former diplomat in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Speaking third, who's sitting just next to me on my left, is Ashley Rinsberg. He's an investigative journalist. He's the author of a book called The Grey Lady Winked, How the New York Times is Misreporting Distortions and Fabrications Radically Alter History, a title that has some kind of relevance if you try and unpick the difference between how some events around the world are reported in the major papers and actually what seems to be going on. Then speaking next on my right is Melissa Chen. She's a managing director and board member of Ideas Beyond Borders, a journalist, an activist, and also a kind of popular presence on social media already. Many of the panelists have immediately said, "Oh, I'm Melissa, I follow your post all the time," so you should check her out too. And then last but by no means least is Dr. Rav Schomer, who's a commentator, podcaster, again, a very lively presence on lots of new media, and an assistant professor of international relations at Webster University, Vienna. For those of you who have joined us yesterday or joined us at the Battle Ideas before, hopefully the format of this discussion should be quite straightforward with those introductory speeches of 5 or 6 minutes, but then very much the spirit of the festival is we can come out to you, the audience, for questions, comments, disagreements, etc., and we look forward to hearing more of those. So without any further introduction, I ask Bill to refer his opening remarks.
Thank you, Jacob. So I just want to make 2 points. The first is that geopolitics begins at home. You can't and you won't solve the world's problems if you're not clear who you are, what you stand for, and where you're going. It's very easy to be clear about what you're against, but ultimately it is what you stand for that really matters. The international and the internal are interlinked. And what we see exemplified in the case of Israel is a fusion between an armed conflict in the Middle East with a cultural conflict in the West, driven in its terms by a quite remarkable domestic moral illiteracy. Only nations with a clear sense of their own self-interest and the ability to connect with others on similar terms can hope to solve the problems that confront us today. But our young people here are being invited to reject Western civilization through the ideology of decolonization and other ideologies. And the nation state is not even the key player anymore. The German security analyst Ulrike Franke recently noted how big tech players in Ukraine from the beginning of the conflict have been some of the more significant participants. Microsoft knew that there was going to be an invasion before anybody else because there was a malware attack in Ukraine that they had been asked to resolve. Amazon were called in within a few hours of the conflict starting in order to secure the nation's data, because loss of data in a conflict is one of the biggest challenges. And SpaceX Starlink were called within 2 days in order to provide Zelensky with communications, and Musk replied on Twitter, done, within 2 hours of being asked. These are not military supply companies. They're not Raytheon, who make missiles, Rheinmetall, who supply tanks, or Lockheed Martin aeroplanes. They're, as I said, big tech. So the protagonists are not state-supported or government-influenced, but private enterprises whose loyalties may not align with the country that they're headquartered in, something that Taiwan is acutely aware of because of Musk's connections to China. They have bigger research and development budgets than their host nations. And in addition, we've seen how much of the fighting in Ukraine has been taking place through the use of commercial drones supplied by DJI in Shenzhen, China, which controls 90% of the world's market in that. That brings me to my second point, which is that whilst it's undoubtedly true that as things currently stand, the coming period will see a shift of power to the East I'm talking about is not the one that you might be imagining. China may be one of the most important economic players in the world, but aside from its own internal growing problems, it remains politically relatively marginal. And that's because we mustn't confuse power with authority. China has a vast military, a huge population, the most cities, over 1 million people in the world, some of the biggest foreign investment in the world, although that's declining, the most PhDs in science and technology on earth. But its responses to the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East have shown it to be naive, opportunistic, and with nothing much more to offer than Western managerialism. It produced a 12-point plan to settle the Ukraine conflict, which any half-baked consultancy group in the West could have written. And its Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a document entitled US Hegemony and Its Perils that's completely in keeping with the mood of the times in the West. Economic power is not cultural authority, which is what China lacks. Reference to Chinese wisdom or Chinese characteristics fails to inspire anybody. And the other rising powers remain so at the level of economics alone, and for now, China can offer little more than a poor version of the same managerial international relations that everybody else does. Rather, and I'll finish on this point, the East I'm referring to is that true authority will accrue to are, maybe surprisingly to you, Ukraine and Israel. And that's because only those who understand what's at stake in the contemporary period and go about doing something about it can have long-term credibility in the eyes and allegiances of the people, not just there, but worldwide. Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty, which is the collective form of human agency or subjectivity. What the war in Ukraine has shown is that real security comes from the people, from being able to call on, motivate, and involve society in matters of collective interest. And Israel is fighting for civilization and humanity itself. It's only those who understand what's at stake and are willing to fight for it who can claim authority in the long run. John Stuart Mill, I'm sure you all are familiar with, famously said, "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things," continuing that the degraded state of moral feeling which thinks nothing is worth a war is much worse. But he also continued, "When people are used as mere instruments for the selfish purposes of a master, such war degrades people. But a war to give victory to their own ideas of right and good, and which is their own war, carried on by their free choice, is often the means of their regeneration." I'll finish there.
Right. Praise the Bill. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, I'm going to bust my limit, probably. But anyway, here goes. It's such a big topic. I'm going to be looking at economics, culture wars, and WMD. So there's an argument for saying that the West has always been in turmoil. And I well remember cups of tea going flying when a rocket aimed at us in the embassy in Baghdad in 2007 caused cups of tea and cucumber sandwiches to go flying. Almost certainly that rocket was shot at the behest of the Iranians, and Tony Blair was due to arrive at precisely that time. Fortunately for him, but not the rest of us, he was late. Consider too the tempestuous events experienced by our parents and grandparents. But I think there are grounds for believing that we have entered a new age of uncertainty and danger, with heightened risks around the destabilization of the so-called rules-based order that we're so familiar with, coupled with a diminishing capability to manage those risks. So what's changed? I'm going to focus, as I say, on economics, culture wars, and WMD. On the economic side, the West, and particularly Europe, is characterized increasingly by debt and economic lethargy. While China has deep-seated economic problems of its own, recent decades have seen a decisive shift eastwards, in my view, in the balance of global economic power. And economic power delivers diplomatic and military power. China is resource hungry, and competition for control over resources and trade has always been a potential source of conflict. And that competition for resources can only grow as the West commits to unachievable net zero targets. There's an argument too for saying that Western economic strength has always been rooted in the availability of cheap energy. And there is a real risk of economic disaster if we miscalculate on net zero. And those who are not our friends will take advantage of that. China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea is punchy, but unlikely to trigger any dramatic escalation in the short to medium term. Taiwan is different. I mean, it's totemic for Beijing. A formal declaration of independence by Taiwan could trigger an invasion. But the position, I think, is likely to remain ambiguous. For all the talk of mounting an invasion of Taiwan would be a formidable proposition. But that hasn't stopped China staging a series of intimidating war games, including in the past few days. And if Taiwan were invaded, there is a real risk that the US would be drawn in. China will, I guess, be looking quite carefully at how Russia fares in Ukraine. And speaking of Ukraine, I think Russia thought that it had Europe, and particularly Germany, on the economic gas hook in early 2022. The muted response post-2014 to the taking of Crimea and the majority of the Donbass also provided confidence to Moscow, so they attacked. The EU's initial response was weak. Arguably, it was the UK's swift provision of NLAW anti-tank capability and other support that averted an early total Ukrainian defeat. Providing military and civil aid to Ukraine is expensive, but what would be the economic, political, and social price if the West abandoned Ukraine to its fate? Culture wars. I mean, history is littered with examples of the terrible things that can happen when bad people take over. So, and I agree with Bill on this, to prevail, liberal democracies need not just economic power, but also self-belief, belief in what they stand for. The present government accuses the right of inventing the culture wars as if the phenomenon was somehow a right-wing fantasy, but they are very real and a deeply worrying, relatively new trend. To those of us who have fought for the cause of freedom of democracy most of their adult lives, it is genuinely very scary indeed to see our own elite, for example, casually dismiss democratic votes they dislike as populist. I have served in nominal democracies in various places around the world where the corrupt ruling elites do precisely the same thing. Democracy is fine so long as I win and keep the power and the money that goes with it. This is not a recipe for liberal democratic success. Identity politics is undermining civil service impartiality, promotion on merit, and organizational effectiveness. And decision-making quality in both government and the private sector is suffering as a result. We risk exchanging the rule of law for rule by lawyers, as well as sovereignty for questionable decisions by ill-constituted foreign courts. And democratic accountability is being further undermined by the wholesale outsourcing of power to unaccountable publicly funded bodies, both at home and abroad. As the distinguished historian Lord Roberts recently pointed out, for decades the post-war institutions were strong enough to resist the battering that came from totalitarian powers from outside. But in recent years, a far more insidious danger has corrupted and wrecked many of them. The threat from within, posed by woke and leftist ideology and hugely aided by a lack of self-belief in institutions themselves. This will, or already is, having an impact on the rights and freedoms won by past generations. I'll just switch quickly to WMD. WMD has been a core concern for the West for decades. The UK, as I know to my cost, went to war on a false WMD prospectus in 2003 after all. US policy on Ukraine is clearly deeply influenced by an intelligence-driven calculus on the risk of provoking a Russian nuclear response. But the risks posed by WMD proliferation are, I'm afraid, growing over time. One might argue that India and Pakistan have more or less kept it under control, and that North Korea has been more or less isolated, but we learn recently that North Korean troops are now about to deploy to the Ukraine. Israel has the bomb, but as a democratic state, the only one in the Middle East. It has thus far demonstrated its ability to manage the capability responsibly. The problem is Iran. Iran has been a destabilizing force in the Middle East ever since Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in 1979. So Israel is fighting a completely legitimate war of self-defense.
Okay, we'll have to leave
Okay.
it. Sorry. Yeah. There is... Anyway, Ashley, your opening thoughts, please.
So I'm Israeli American. I moved to Israel in around 2005, 2006 after university. And I started writing about Israel for a small newspaper called Israel Insider at the time. This was right at the tail end of the Second Intifada, where one of my first experiences in Israel as a newcomer to the country was being in a market that had just experienced a suicide bombing attack. And it was only about an hour afterwards that I was there where, life just continued to resume and people continued to go shopping, which really shocked me deeply. But what it showed me was how inured Israelis had become to this kind of thing over the past 2 years of experiencing hundreds, if not thousands of such attacks, bus bombings, suicide attacks on weddings and festivals, and that kind of thing. But what's interesting to me about that whole period is that it came on the back of Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton, together with Yasser Arafat, creating a deal to give the Palestinians something like 90% of what they had asked for, which is Gaza, most of the West Bank, parts of East Jerusalem, and the response was a terror war. So what this signals to me, and what I think about right now with this current war, is that the physical attack is really not the main attack when you're dealing with a framework like asymmetric warfare. The main attack, and this is something we've seen with 9/11. 9/11, the physical attack was just the opening shot. The real attack was the 20 years that came afterwards of delegitimization, the establishment of narratives that are corrosive, that eat from within, the narrative about America being a colonial power, inverting essentially all of the most fundamental values in a society to attack it from within, delegitimize it, and destabilize it. That's the real goal, because of course, Al-Qaeda could never actually damage the United States physically or militarily. So what do? They turn to the world of ideas. This is exactly what we've seen happen over the last year or so with regard to Israel, where a massive, organized, coordinated campaign has been established and rolled out to attack Israel at its very fundamental basis, which is its core legitimacy. We're no longer talking about who should get what in a potential deal in regarding Israel and the Palestinian territories. We're now talking about Zionism as a post-colonial settler enterprise, all these sort of made-up terms that have been retailed for the public and get people really fired up, especially in the West, because in the West there's sort of no longer this coherent corporate identity that people can work towards. They're looking for stuff outside, and they find it in these foreign wars and foreign things that can inspire people and make them feel good about themselves. But one other thing I would say on that regard is that Israel, and this is something that people in the West, I think on both sides really miss, is that it's just a different sense of identity than what we have in the West today, where, you know, a good friend of mine who is one of the smartest people I know, he's probably someone that a lot of people you will know from his activity on social media, said to me right after the war, Israel should do nothing. It should not respond at all. And this just fundamentally misses who Israelis are as a society, and also the kind of threat that they face. Where you have 1,200 people killed in one day, that means virtually every single person in the country has been affected directly. They know someone who was killed on that day, including myself. So the response is not just like a kind of, you know, let's shake it off and let's fight for the PR victory and let's see if we can achieve a moral victory here, because you can't. It's sort of baked in that you will never achieve that public sphere moral victory, this sort of abstract concept. And what you're actually fighting for is actual victory, the way that wars are fought, when one side attacks another side and the other side responds, not by trying to win a sort of war on CNN or on NPR, but by defeating the other side and making sure that they no longer have the capacity to do the thing that they did initially. And this is something that I think Hamas also missed. This is like a big thing where Hamas had understood from Israel that the Israelis were mostly interested in containment. Their strategic vision was to contain Hamas, to continue to build within Israel, to build economically, socially, culturally, et cetera, and of course diplomatically. And Hamas, I think their vision for what was going to happen was that they would stage a sort of shocking attack, Israel would reel, maybe there'd be a limited invasion or incursion, and within 2-3 months it would be over, and Sinwar would come out and declare victory, and everything would be amazing. What they missed is that on that day, the attack was so savage that they fundamentally changed their own enemy. And the enemy that they created was one that had to be determined to achieve victory, not to achieve PR wins. The Israelis learned that it was no longer about that. It was really just about going to the end so that you achieve the goals of the war. And it doesn't sound good, it doesn't look good, and it doesn't feel good. But when you have 1,200 people killed in a single day, apparently for, again, this can be justified in all sorts of manners. We talked about the occupation, which of course elides the deal that was made in 2000 that was responded to with a terror war. But when that happens, the only thing left to do is to defend yourself and attempt to win. And this is something an idea that the West has given up on it in a lot of different ways by saying it's impossible, ideas live in people's heads, Hamas is an idea, you can never defeat an idea, so don't even try. But the reality is that you can win these wars, you can defeat an enemy. And this is one of the things I think will come out of this from Israel's point of view, which is to show the West that, especially with the fight against Islamism, you can defeat it if you try.
Yeah, everyone.
And Melissa, over to you.
So just a show of hands here. How many of you actually think that you will experience a global conflict in the form, you can call it World War III if you like, in the next 10 years? Sorry. How many of you think we'll experience a global conflict or World War III in the next 10 years? Okay. How about in your lifetime? And someone raised it twice. And how many already think it's well underway or we're close to it? Interestingly, all the same hands. So long before October 7th, the remaking of the world order was already well underway. I don't know if you noticed, but if you were a basketball coach in the NBA in the United States, you couldn't tweet in support of Hong Kong. I don't know if you noticed that a professor at UCL here in your country would find herself under investigation and canceled from teaching a course after running a discussion about modern slavery in China. Did you notice that if you were a famous movie director, someone like Martin Scorsese, say, that you couldn't make a film about the Dalai Lama in Tibet and that the CEO of Disney would have to, which is an American company, would have to travel to China to grovel and apologize to the Premier of China. Did you notice that David Lammy was unable to host the former PM of Taiwan here in London because he didn't want to anger China before his trip? So how is it that China can extend its tendrils of repression and coercion so far beyond its sovereign borders and affect what all of these people, and all of these people that I just listed are British and American nationals here overseas, what they can actually say and do in their very own country? And this is just the cultural layer. This is just the software layer. If we go down one more layer to the hardware, did you notice that China is now the world's largest shipbuilder with a capacity that's more than 230 times greater than the United States? That it has the biggest navy in terms of the number of vessels, but not tonnage? Did you notice that China's pretty much all of Africa right now? Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on October 7th, China's support of Putin and refusal to condemn Hamas, but rebuke Israel instead, makes it clear that it has thrown its lot in with a certain club. It's a distinct bloc that has emerged, and that is comprising China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The Economist calls it the Quartet of Chaos. The Foreign Affairs magazine calls it the Axis of Upheaval. But what are they upheaving? They're upheaving the old world order. Whatever you want to call it, this group of nations has forged closer ties. They supply weapons to each other and shared know-how. And they run influence campaigns using their closed societies to hack our open societies. After decades of unfettered globalization where the US abetted the rise of a geopolitical adversary, thinking erroneously that economic liberalization of the Chinese economy would lead to political freedoms, we now see the US and China decoupling at an unprecedented rate as tariffs are imposed on imports and the trade war escalates. Our mistake was assuming that markets were a vector for maximizing liberty. Instead, it was a mechanism China exploited to export their model and culture to our shores. Instead, China used market access to reshape the world in its own image. In my line of work, we are seeing firms de-risk from China, reducing their exposure in various ways, from supply chain inputs to rebalancing their investment portfolios away from companies that have high exposure to the Chinese market. Meanwhile, sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine have failed to make a dent, banning the country from the international financial system, the SWIFT system, seems only to have spurred Russia to launch a gold-backed digital currency and an alternative cross-border payment system. BRICS, I don't know if you've heard of this term. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And this is the group of emerging markets which investors decades ago were celebrating. Now it's BRICS, EEAU, it's basically expanded, like LGBT has expanded to LGBTQIAS+, as fast as that. And the formation of this bloc makes it very clear that these nations actually reject the Western-led post-World War II order and want to build their own inner circle of trust. As the world reorganizes into a bipolar world, the world is becoming more and more unstable. The difference between this Cold War and the old one, which animated the 20th century, is that this one is not just between countries, it is within countries. Our cultural differences are weaponized such that foreign policy and geopolitics are viewed through the lens of culture wars here at home. How else do you explain queers for Palestine? These blocs are not just driven by geopolitics and economics, but now they're being shaped increasingly by social and moral forces as well. So the clarity of choice in the previous Cold War is gone. Here in the West, it is increasingly being cast as a culture war. And just like the last Cold War, the new one will engulf almost every corner of the world. New culture war will demand that nations and tribes within nations take sides. And it rides on top of geopolitical blocs, oriented around different systems and military alliances. History, far from ending, is about to restart once again.
Well, great.
Okay, then our final opening speech goes to Ralph.
Just a few things maybe also for you worthwhile to remember. The simplest one is the future belongs to those who show up for it. And one of my most favorite statistics is in the early 1900s or the early 20th century as well, the UK had more inhabitants than Nigeria. By 1960, Nigeria and the UK had about the same number of people. And in about 30 years, Nigeria will have more people than the entire European Union. So I cannot tell you what the future is going to look like, but I can tell you that Nigeria is going to have one, the European Union probably not so much. So I'm always very entertained by the idea of neo-colonialism that is supposedly enacted by people that have a fertility rate under 2. One of the reasons why the British had an empire is not because they were so mean. I don't think they were. I mean, I'm an old school imperialist about 100 years beyond my sell-by date, but that's a personal issue. But because they managed a demographic problem, right? You can only colonize another continent if you have a surplus of people. The British, the Americans, the continental Europeans, we have no surplus of people. So the idea that we will enact any kind of colonial policy is simply impossible. We see it in the other way around. I always find this interesting when people say that, for example, Islamization of Europe is like a conspiracy theory. It's not. It makes complete sense. If one part of the world has a population surplus and the other part is a population deficit, well, it's arbitrage. People will move from one direction to the other. This is completely natural. I never understood why something that makes a lot of sense was then all of a sudden termed a conspiracy theory. No, I would do the same thing, right? If one group of people has 6 children, another group of people has 0 children, you don't need an Ivy League degree in math to figure out who has a future and who doesn't. That being said, of course, brings me also to one of the issues we've been talking about quite a bit today, which is frustrating. I understand this, but of course, again, I always try to distinguish between morality and reality. We are moral beings as humans, and I think that's very important, but there are things that we cannot simply ignore because it goes against what we think is morally right or morally worthy of approval. And if we look, for example, at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, basically we have a war between 2 countries that are in a demographic death spiral. By 2100, Yemen will have more inhabitants than Russia. So if the average Russian would be hanging from a tree, he would be on the endangered species list. Now, that's not the case, so we have to deal with this in a different way. But we have this cognitive dissonance in many parts of the West and elsewhere, where we have a conduct of policy as if we still have the demographics of the 19th century, but we don't. Right? The Nazis were always worried that they would have too many people and too little space. And apparently it seems that Putin thinks something similar, that, possessing certain territories in Ukraine is absolutely crucial for the survival of Russia. Now, I'm not sure if the Russians heard that, because if you take a closer look, even if he would conquer all of Ukraine, where is he going to take the Russians from to fulfill his colonial project? And of course, unfortunately, the same is true with Ukraine as well. Ukraine has been in a demographic death spiral years before the war started. So this is very frustrating. We see 2 countries whose main obligation should be to ensure that there still will be Ukrainians, that there will still be Russians in the future. And particularly, of course, in the case of Russia, they took a different path. But I think that's a form of cognitive dissonance. Similar with China. Right? It's very interesting to see that the Chinese, for several reasons, some of them economic, some of them historical, some of them cultural, seems very obsessed with the status of Taiwan, which I get. It's, as I said before, it's an emotional topic for them. But China has similar trouble, right? China most likely will grow old before they grow rich, and they will have similar problems than other countries. They don't have the demographics to be a challenging superpower. The United States potentially will remain the exception here because for whatever reason, God, nature, whatever your favorite explanation might be, they have been blessed with a land that simply is made for survival. They have natural resources, they have their own food production, they have energy production, so they will stick around for a while beyond this. But this is, as I said, this is going to be the biggest question. Now, going to the social issues, yes. I want to tell you a short anecdote that I enjoyed very much, but I think it kind of summarizes some other problems as well. A friend of mine, a journalist, but I don't hold it against him, went to a meeting that was announced as being about building bridges. And he thought, this must be a great meeting. It must be about, how we can get different communities together, how we can, find the common sense and common approaches and compromise. He was then very disappointed to find out that, in fact, the meeting was about engineers talking about, building bridges. But I get his mistake, because in today's world, it's much easier to build metaphorical bridges than real bridges. Have you tried it in the UK? It's almost impossible, right? And the same is true in other areas as well. We can no longer build anything. And I think this is also one of the reasons falling into this as well. A country, a society, a civilization that believes in itself, right, is eager about conquering the future, whatever the future might look like. But in the West, I think we're constantly fighting battles with the past and completely neglect what the future might look like or what the future could look like. We talked about 9/11. I find 9/11 is always a good example because what happened on 9/11 was done to the United States. It was done to the West. But it took them 10 years to rebuild a building where the other buildings were destroyed. This is something they did to themselves. I mean, I assume that many of you either have been to New York City or have seen the skyline of New York City. But I just want to remind you, the majority of that skyline was built during the Great Depression. The Empire State Building was built in under 5 years. Now, we can't do this anymore, right? If you try to build something until you get the environmental impact study of the environmental impact study, it's going to take 12 years, right? There's no point in doing this. I mean, the biggest threat to trees in this country is all the paper you need to fill out the regulatory form, but not the actual thing you're going to build. And I think this is one of the issues that we probably have to talk about in greater detail. Thank you.
Great, thank you.